Well, as usual, I have a lot to say about that. A lot to say, and I'll
But
start.
first, a word from our sponsors.
Yes, but first, a word from Audible. Audible has a series of audiobooks.
Hi, I'm Jacob Kenny.
And I'm Liam McPherson.
It's the newest edition of your mechanic's favorite podcast.
It's
Speech from the Throne, episode 14.
We're here to bring you the latest and greatest from the halls of power.
But not with more Duolingo push notifications threatening to kill your firstborn. We're just here to argue.
Hey, Jacob, what are we talking about today?
Well, Liam, I'm about to do something that no pundit is ever supposed to do, and that is trying to generalize a provincial election result to a federal prediction. Because what we just saw in Ontario, I believe, is a simulation for what the 2015 election could have looked like if, rather than the federal Liberals governed by a competent, charismatic, incredibly well-known leader, they instead had what one of our friends, a longtime listener of the podcast, called Stephen Del Pupa as their leader. Basically, a nameless Liberal functionary. Essentially, it would have been a Liberal collapse like we saw in Ontario. And there are many reasons, I think, in these Ontario election results and in the predictions for the Quebec election results to make us wonder about how electorally effective the federal Liberals are going to be in the post-Trudeau era. So first, you and I, we've wondered for a long time why the Liberal Party keeps this guy around. I mean, we have the blackface scandal, we had SNC Lavalin, that We charity. There's been plenty of reasons to get rid of Justin Trudeau, but the party has always resisted. And there seems to be some good reason for doing this in Trudeau's own personal popularity. His numbers, according to Angus Reid's Trudeau tracker, are still in the 40s nationally, versus his party is in the 30s. So he runs between 5 to 10 points ahead of his party. And most importantly, his personal numbers are strong where they need to be. His personal numbers are highest in Ontario, in Quebec, in Atlantic Canada, in BC, where the Liberals need those numbers to get the biggest boosts where they can get the most seats. Now, if we look at the Chrétien-Martin strategy, it was essentially an Ontario-first strategy. They won nearly every seat in Ontario, and they picked some seats here and there, and that's how they got their governments. Now, if we see a collapse of the federal Liberals in Ontario the same way that the provincial Liberals fell apart in Ontario, obviously that strategy is not going to work. Trudeau has reached out to Quebec, though, and he's doing well in Quebec, much better than the Martin and Chrétien Liberals. In the early 2000s, the BQ, the Bloc Québécois, was getting like 50 seats. Now they're down to 30. And those extra 20 seats for the Liberals have really been what separates Trudeau from his strong minority position, where he's obviously the only one that can be prime minister, to whereas if he had lost those 20 seats, if the Bloc had those extra 20, he'd be pretty close to tied with the Tories. He'd be in a much more tenuous grasp of power. Unfortunately, in Quebec, we see the Liberal brand there is also faltering. Now, the provincial Liberals and the federal Liberals in Quebec are quite different, but they still represent similar groups of voters. Then specifically strong in Montreal and with Anglophone voters. Well, in Montreal, the Quebec Solidaire is really eating the Liberals' lunch. And then with Anglophone voters, we have a new Anglo party. The Canadian party is trying to steal those Federalist voters. And the polls in the Quebec election coming this fall seem to show that the Liberals there are going to get completely trounced. In the West, we have decades now, basically, where Liberal voters nationally have been splitting themselves between Conservatives and NDP, and essentially there is no Liberal party to speak of provincially in BC, Alberta, Saskatchewan, or Manitoba. In BC, the Social Credit took over the Liberals post-1991, and the Liberals have been a right-wing party. And the NDP, it's crossed over a little bit to grab some of those federal Liberals, and we have guys like the NDP Premier Ujjal Dosanjh. He became a health minister federally for Martin in 2004. But essentially, we just have two parties, and the Liberals were removed from BC. In Alberta, the Liberals and NDP were constantly splitting left-wing vote from the 80s to 2000s. But in 2012, the Liberal voters backed the PCs in Alberta to prevent an even farther right-wing party from getting power, the Wild Rose. That led to a Liberal collapse, and ever since, the NDP has been the primary left-wing choice. In Saskatchewan, the Liberals and PCs merged to prevent NDP governments. They formed the Saskatchewan Party. And again, there's been no Liberal Party since in Saskatchewan. And in Manitoba, it's just like Alberta, there was no formal merger, but Liberal support just died after there was two consecutive whoppings for the Liberals in 1990, 1995. And now the Manitoba Liberal Party has never gotten more than 15% in any election since 1995. So if we look at this picture altogether, we see the Liberal Party, it's still strong in Atlantic Canada. We can see them probably coming back someday to power in Nova Scotia or New Brunswick. They're still in power in Newfoundland. But Atlantic Canada, it's getting less and less important with every successive election. It's not the part of the country that's growing. The Liberal brand is in real trouble in Ontario and Quebec. And then they're completely irrelevant in the West, the part of the country that's actually growing. So if we see a Liberal Party that doesn't have Justin Trudeau, someone with universal name recognition, to govern it, is the Liberal brand going to be strong enough to carry itself in a federal election? It seems to me, since it's so weak at the provincial level in so many areas of the country, likely not. And now, on the progressive side, we also have a charisma problem, because Jagmeet Singh has personal numbers that are even stronger than Justin Trudeau's. So if we take away Trudeau's universal name recognition, Jagmeet Singh's charisma could be enough to steal a lot of progressive voters from an already weakening Liberal Party. So this, I think, all spells could likely be disaster for the federal Liberals in the next election. My recommendation, what I think we need to discuss in this podcast, is how they solve this. The problems are very real. My solution, I think, is basically the Trudeau's got to find someone with a personality immediately. Trudeau cannot be the one to run in the next election. That seems obvious. There's too much baggage at this point. But anyone else, especially if they wait till the very last possible minute to remove him, is not going to have enough name recognition. They're not going to have enough celebrity, basically, to let their personal brand inflate the party in the same way that Trudeau was. I think that the Liberals need to try making their leadership race just as much of a spectacle as the CPC has to get people involved. And if they fail to do this, they're in big trouble.
Well, as usual, I have a lot to say about that. A lot to say, and I'll start...
But first, a word from our sponsors.
Yes, but first a word from Audible. Audible has a series of audiobooks. Lots of thoughts on that. My first thought is Justin Trudeau's longevity in the Liberal Party, and I think you covered one piece very succinctly when you said that his popularity was a large reason that he hasn't been deposed as leader to date. The other part that you and I have talked about in our private conversations is the fact that he essentially owns the Liberal Party. What do I mean by that? Justin Trudeau took a Liberal Party federally that was down to, I think, it was either 34 or 36 seats in 2011, which was a historic blow to a party that had either been opposition or government for its entire existence. The mechanisms for fundraising, the mechanisms for data collection were antiquated. I believe data collection was, if not antiquated, then non-existent. Like, it was very, needed some desperate 21st centuryifying, and he took a party that was in a weakened state and he built it from the ground up over the course of years before he finally got into power. The way that the party works, the way that leadership contests work, the way that everything else works was put together sort of, or retrofitted by his team. And it doesn't mean he literally owns the party. I mean, people said that about Stephen Harper, but it means that you'll forever be an influential figure in the party. And right now, as the sitting prime minister, he has enough influence, particularly given the work he's put into rebuilding that party, that if he wants to stick around, I fear that people won't tell him not to. And I say I fear because I'm in complete agreement with you. I think the Liberals have needed a leadership refresh for about a year now. a couple years now, really. I would say like since SNC, I think that enough was enough, though it was too early in his term then for people to kind of decide on that for whatever reason. But now for sure, like he needs to step aside. Will he step aside? I think there's a serious doubt that he will step aside. I think that he, like a lot of prime ministers and a lot of leaders in this era, lives in a bubble of, I mean, we all live in information bubbles of some extent, but he lives in a bubble of a small cadre of staffers and people in senior portfolios, and they dole out partisan lines and they look at polls a lot and they know where they need to pick up votes. And I think he's convinced that he's got it down to a science. And I think everybody flies too close to the sun in that regard. Everybody thinks they have it down to a science until they're too unpopular and they completely collapse. I think he thinks he can pull it off. I'm not sure he can pull it off. And I mean, Justin Trudeau's been doubted before and he's proved us wrong before, but I don't think he's the right leader to take this party into the future. And I think that they would save themselves a lot of grief if they started onboarding a successor in a year or two, had a leadership contest in a year or two. He's already earned political stability with the NDP Liberal agreement until 2025. Who's to say that he doesn't step aside in a year? I mean, maybe that's part of the plan. Maybe that's why he made the agreement. I'm not sure. I'm not in his head. He could very well step down. If he does step down, he's going to need to give that new person a couple of years to get introduced to the public, to get comfortable in the role, to build relationships with caucus and with voters, with the opposition leaders, everybody. And it sure as hell better not be a plank of wood. We can't have that. We've had that federally twice already. We had Stéphane Dion, extremely intelligent guy, very, very smart guy, brilliant political mind, not a great face for the leader of the party. Then you have Michael Ignatieff, who led the Liberal Party down to those 30-some seats, the historic blow, because he was sort of an obtuse academic that had trouble relating, and he's even sort of said that in his, I can't remember which book of his, but there's a book of his where he talks about his experience as Liberal leader, and he admits he wasn't cut out for it, and that it didn't come naturally to him.
I think that's called Fire and Ash, I believe.
Is that what it's called?
That's his memoirs of the 2011 campaign, yeah. It's a great book.
It was devastating for him, and obviously, because, I mean, he's remembered as the guy that doomed the Liberals to third-party status. And I'm sure Stephen Del Duca in Ontario provincially is going through a similar thing. I mean, you do feel for people that put their names out there and then fail, but I mean, you got to learn lessons from it, and you got to do it right the next time. And I think that the federal Liberals can take something of an example maybe from the Ontario situation. I mean, it's not as black and white as that. Like, there's nuances between different political jurisdictions, but just looking at that and going, maybe we don't want to be in this position 3 years from now when we send the voters back to the polls. Maybe we want to reinvigorate the party brand and continue the work that our prime minister has done by that our leader has done by putting a fresh face in there, letting them get used to the existing infrastructure and get introduced to Canadians. And I think that's the smartest thing to do strategically. I think that we've seen success when that's happened. Like, for example, when Jean Chrétien left the third majority term early and handed the reins over to Paul Martin. I know he only won a minority, but he won, and he extended their lease on government for another 3 years, which can be quite meaningful. So I caution people when they say, oh, no, it has to be done like right away with the flick of a switch. And no, that's usually when it fails. Like, Kim Campbell had like 6 months or something in 1993. Like, she didn't have very much time at all to introduce herself to people as not only the new prime minister, but the new leader of the Progressive Conservatives at the time. And it failed disastrously. John Turner was put in early 1984 after Pierre Trudeau left. And that was a disaster. If you give people a couple of years to acquaint themselves, it's very endemic in Canada's political culture. We've gotten into this problem where when an opposition leader loses one election, they're never allowed to try again. And sometimes that's for good reason. Like, I would say for Del Duca, for Andrew Scheer, that was a good reason. Aaron O'Toole, not that I didn't dunk on him a lot, because I did dunk on him a lot. Like, the way that he tried to kind of straddle the balance between the social conservatives and the progressive conservatives was very obvious, and it didn't work. And, that was his failure. But it would have been interesting had he stuck around another year or two, how different that party would look versus, say, if Pierre Poilievre takes the reins in September. So I think part of it is just giving new leaders a chance to adjust, not making them hit the ground running, launch into a campaign, build caucus relationships all at once. They need time to get comfortable, to get in there. They'll develop a style, they'll develop a team, and they need that time. And, Andrew Scheer, for example, like I agree that he should have been outed after one election because he had 2 years. to introduce himself to the public. He had 2 years to make those relationships, and he failed. Nobody really knew who he was, and when they got to know him, they didn't like him, and they made a lot of missteps on that campaign. Nothing landed. That should have been a winnable campaign for them after the blackface scandal, and they blew it. Whereas somebody like, Kathleen Wynne coming on at the end of
I was just going to mention her.
of McGuinty's term, who the hell thought that the Liberals were going to win a majority after 10 years of Dalton McGuinty? Nobody in their right mind thought that was going to happen, but it happened. And part of that was she was new. She was popular because she was new. She refreshed the brand. They changed their logo. They updated a bunch of stuff. All that, it sounds like small stuff, but that can really help. And I think Trudeau would be doing himself and the country a favor if he stepped aside. I'm not sure if he will, but that's my general thoughts on that. I think too often we get into the pump and dump of like one election, one leader, and that's not good most of the time. But then on the flip side, we have longtime leaders who are successful staying in too long because they can claim that, well, look, I was successful, so I'm entitled to. And I think that holds us back.
Yeah, and I think that there are probably two names that I would mention. So Wynne is the first, and I think that's a very clear example of a very successful leadership handoff. I would also probably mention Christy Clark in BC, the BC Liberals as well. And I think in both of those cases, Clark and Wynne were very clear departures from the men that had come before them. Particularly Wynne, you think like the first openly gay premier in Ontario, and Clark, the first female premier of BC. They had like a completely different narrative and a completely different look than the leader before them. And so they may have continued similar policies, but they had different personal appeals, they had different styles, they had narratives around them that were uniquely their own, and that were good contrasts to the leaders before them, but as well good contrasts with the leaders that they were competing against in their own political context. Like, I mean, Wynne against Hudak is an amazing contrast that was only going to help her. It is much more difficult when Wynne was competing on the left for votes against Andrea Horwath, and then, that just, it completely collapsed. She was working against someone who wasn't as good as a contrast. And that's, again, why if you're on the left, you contrast yourself with someone on the right. You don't contrast yourself with someone else on the left, is my recommendation. So if the Liberals are going to find someone who is a departure from Trudeau tonally, I guess the question is, who is it going to be? So Chrystia Freeland seems to be the caucus favorite, seems to definitely be the party favorite. And I think that she probably has the ability to be someone who is different than Trudeau, although she is certainly willing to parrot his lines, particularly when it comes to this political context globally, with the war in Ukraine. Like, it's the Ukraine stuff where she has a very compelling personal narrative that's totally different from what Trudeau had before. It's hard for us as Canada to get our message to other world leaders. And in many cases, we've sort of been made fun of, like in trade agreements, the Trans-Pacific Trade Agreement. Trudeau, when he got into power, his first move was basically to rename that agreement, the Comprehensive and Progressive Trans-Pacific Trade Agreement. And now the Australians, the Indians, the Japanese, the Americans that were all part of those negotiations, they make fun of us behind our back, because that was basically the only thing he was interested in talking about, changing the name of the agreement rather than actually changing the substance of the agreement. And that's been a common theme in our foreign policy. If Trudeau allowed Chrystia Freeland to be a true leader on the world stage, and I think she is someone who absolutely has the credibility to do that, this could be a really compelling narrative for her that I think could capture the public's imagination. And this is a time, more than any, that we need someone like that. The world, especially the Western world, needs a leader who's going to stand for democracy in the face of growing authoritarianism, who's going to stand for liberal principles in the face of growing right-wing flirtation with fascism. And there's no one better, I think, than Chrystia Freeland and his caucus to do this. But he needs to be able to step aside and let her play that role. He needs to start allowing her to take more and more of a policy direction, I think, if that's going to happen. That's where I worry. I've seen a lot of Trudeau staffers who are suggesting that, if Pierre Poilievre wins the Conservative nomination, the Liberals should go into a snap election against him and run before he's well situated. They're basically chasing that one majority. I think Trudeau, he just wants that majority before he steps down. And it's so dangerous. It's so dangerous to do that. I could not disagree more with that strategy. You have someone who can be a leader, but you gotta let her shine. And that's what I would say.
Yeah, and I mean, we saw shades of that during like you said, during the Ukraine crisis. I mean, it's still ongoing, but like in the initial kind of when we were seeing what the government of Canada was going to do, she was the leader of that. And I do think, many columnists and pundits speculated this, and I agree with it, that it was maybe something of a road test. I do think maybe she is Justin Trudeau's favorite to lead the party, but it doesn't mean that she's going to lead the party, because there has to be a contest, there has to be, all this stuff. But I mean, I do think that was something of a road test. Like, okay, you want to be in the spotlight, let's see how you handle it. And she stepped right up. She stepped up to the challenge, and she's handled herself very well, and she's shown herself to be very competent. And even people who've lost faith in Trudeau tend to speak with respect for her. I don't know if they know her all that well, but she's definitely known. Basically, the thing with this particular government is the face of this government, more than even the Stephen Harper government, has been Justin Trudeau. In the Stephen Harper government, you could name 5 or 6 ministers. In this government, I can name more than that because I'm a big nerd. But my father, for example, one of the only cabinet ministers that he even knows about is Chrystia Freeland. That's one of the only cabinet ministers that have managed to sort of break through the noise in terms of like public perception, getting their name out there. And that speaks to her talent, I think. And I mean, she's been put in the spotlight recently to prove herself, and she stepped right up. Other than that, I mean, you're going to need to let the leadership play out the contest and kind of see what happens. I know that there's a few other people circling, like Mélanie Joly has been named as somebody who's thinking about running. And who else has been floated? Anita Anand, Mark Miller, another one of Trudeau's pals. They grew up together. That could be a dangerous one, but I mean, he also carries himself very well. He stepped up to the plate, getting into a very tough file that the government has not done well on by any standpoint, I don't think. I mean, sure, better than Harper, but that was a low bar. So he stepped into a hard file, and one of the first things he said was, we need to give land back, and he seems to be seriously working on trying to do that. But Mark Miller strikes me as a serious guy with serious ideas. And I would not include Mélanie Joly. Like, she's more of a kind of like, she knows how to market herself and knows how to campaign. I don't know how she would govern. I'm not sure. And then Anita Anand got a lot of hype after the vaccine procurement stuff, because she did very well with that when everybody thought we screwed it up. It turns out we did better than a lot of folks, and she gets a lot of credit for that, I think, rightfully. And her French is very good, and she's a person of color. That'd be very historic to have a person of color leading the Liberal Party. So I think, progressives like us who've been disaffected by the current Liberal Party, we were talking in the last pod, I was commenting on the fact that you were joining the NDP at the provincial level, or getting involved at the provincial level with them. And I sort of commented, that's not for me, blah, blah, blah. And one of the reasons it's not is because of what I talked about was, waiting and seeing to kind of see what the options are. And part of that is waiting for the federal leadership to play itself out and see what kind of candidates step up to the plate, because I'm sure we'll see more step up to the plate than what's been speculated. We always do. And these races never play out how you think they're going to. The 2017 leadership race in the Conservatives, it was supposed to be a coronation for Maxime Bernier. It went 13 rounds, and a guy who sold 10,000 memberships won. So things can happen, and I'm interested to see where the party ends up. I'm maybe a little hopeful, because I hope we can kind of move on. Trudeau definitely got a lot of things done that Harper never would have gotten done, and I know centrist voters like to give him credit for that, and even some centre-left voters, but there are some progressive ideals that we need in this country, and there are parts of our country that are hemorrhaging, like healthcare, senior care, that are absolutely hemorrhaging, and some of that's a provincial jurisdiction, but the feds have a role to play. The Canada Health Transfer has a role to play. And I look forward to hopefully a Liberal Party that's a little bit more willing to jump on some of those files than Trudeau has been, and it's not that he doesn't spend. That's what I find so perplexing is, he certainly spends money. It's just, where is it going? oh, it's going to a Canada Infrastructure Bank that's hardly developed any projects at all. I think like one or two. Or buying a pipeline to please a province that was never going to like you anyway and was going to demonize you anyway. Like just the things, it's the things they choose to spend their money on that's bizarre. I don't mind spending if you spend it on the right things and you reap the rewards later. And I mean, other than infrastructure, which is relatively easy to pour money into, funding individual projects has been the norm. You know, they haven't even used their infrastructure bank for most of the infrastructure promises that they've delivered on, and the policies, or the funding that they've contributed. Most of that hasn't been through the infrastructure bank. So anyway, long tangent, but I look forward to seeing a party that kind of gives some of those ideas more serious consideration. If we're going to spend money, okay, we're going to spend it, but how are we going to spend it? Where is it going to go? What mechanisms are going to be used to deliver these things? I think what the Trudeau government has shown is that you can say all the right things, but if you do a slapdash job, everybody's going to notice it, and it reflects poorly on you and your credentials.
I think one of the greatest potential weaknesses for the Liberal Party is that there is undoubtedly a trend towards polarization in Western democratic politics. The extremes of the left and right, the extremes of the left and right.
Left and white.
yeah, I know.
Slip.
Oh my God. The extremes of the left and right are exciting voters the most, it seems, and they're the huge growth areas. And the thing about Trudeau is that I think in 2015 he sort of recognized this. He moved the centrist Liberals sort of to the left of the NDP in 2015, particularly if you're talking fiscally, where he was not even promising at all to balance the budget. He promised to have modest deficits, which we'd never really seen anyone promise before. Usually you accidentally run a deficit. It's very rare that you are willing to admit that you will run them, versus, of course, Mulcair tying himself in knots, showing how he could balance the budget in a progressive way. And so Trudeau really outflanked him on the left. And Jagmeet Singh's greatest weakness, when I talk to NDP supporters, is that many of the NDP voters don't really think of him as being a sincere leftist. I mean, he was certainly the moderate choice in the NDP leadership. People that were more left are thinking more like Guy Caron when he was running. They wanted to vote for more unionist types, versus a lot of more traditional activists in the NDP think that Jagmeet Singh is more style than substance, which is something you and I in the Liberal Party have said many times about Justin Trudeau. So if you have a Liberal leader who is actually willing to embrace some really hard progressive principles, but not progressive principles that only appeal to the 40% or the 30% that are on the left, but progressive principles that actually have crossover appeal. And there are lots of things that have crossover appeal. Like universal basic income is something that pulls super well. Higher minimum wage is something that pulls super well. Healthcare funding is something that pulls like 90%. You can make a really progressive platform that are things that us centrist, moderate liberals would think are, they're too radical, the public will never accept them. But each individually, like even something like a wealth tax polls at like 70% popularity. You can actually put together a really ambitious left-wing agenda that polls particularly well and outflank the NDP. Jagmeet Singh's personal numbers are really good, but he has that soft underbelly of support that you can steal from if you're willing to take that mantle. I think the Liberals have become a little bit afraid of adopting that mantle for some reason.
Yeah, I don't understand that.
Yeah, I don't really get that either. I think there's just they become sort of obsessed with the suburban voters in the 905, and they're convinced that these people are more ideological than they are. I think they're absolutely convinced that suburban voters are afraid of left-wing ideas, when every piece of polling says that, yes, suburban voters are afraid of the term socialist. Suburban voters are afraid of things that are framed as too left-wing. But if you ask them policy by policy, whether they like policies, they often will still support left-wing ideas. So the question, I think, is more about branding. It's not really about policies. I think fundamentally the party is misunderstanding a lot of these voters here.
I mean, I think you just hit the nail on the head. I was that was the point I was going to make. If you didn't, for sure, like Doug Ford and Justin Trudeau pull from a lot of the same voters, and yep. I think that proves your point right there. If those same voters can go and elect Doug Ford and then go and elect Justin Trudeau,
what do they really believe?
Exactly, and the reality is that I think Justin Trudeau's team is so risk averse sometimes with things that they think will be perceived as too far when it's really about the way that you market it. So, for example, with basic income, I talked to you and another friend of ours privately about the idea of promoting a basic income under the guise of a data dividend. Now, the ideal situation would be to just introduce a basic income. But if you're really that afraid of what a suburban mom or a suburban dad is going to think of, a basic income, and that they think it's going to, pay people to stay home, and like all the other old things, like it's just the old welfare arguments being dusted off. If people genuinely think that, then don't market it that way. Market it like a data dividend. Now, what's a data dividend? So just to give you a quick explain like I'm five explanation. There's something that was not only floated but implemented in California by Governor Gavin Newsom. And what it does is it purports to compensate consumers for all of the data that is being used by big corporations like, Facebook, Google, Twitter, Snapchat, Instagram, like all those guys. When you're using the web, they're selling your data to third parties, and you agree to that when you sign up for the platform, and you receive no compensation in return for the use of your data. So Gavin Newsom said, let's compensate the taxpayer for the data that's being used. And that by itself is a great idea. But implementing basically what is in effect a basic income and marketing it as a data dividend, I think is probably one of the most brilliant ways you could implement it.
And then you make the big internet companies, the Facebook or the Googles, are the ones paying for it, and they're super unpopular as well. Like if you make basic income that you fund by increasing the taxes of the highest bracket is not going to be popular, because tax hikes in general are not popular, and for some reason the public they'll often say that they like the idea of a basic income, but often when you go door to door to explain it, you'll hit resistance.
Yeah.
But the idea of a data dividend that's funded by specifically tech companies, which everyone hates,
higher taxes on big tech.
Exactly. That's perfect. Anyone in the political spectrum will support that. And yet, substantively, is that really significantly different than how we're describing basic income?
No.
No, not at all. And in fact, when you put it into a bill, you can basically write it as you wish. But the way that you market it is totally different.
And here's the key.
You're marketing it on the strengths. Yeah.
Here's the key, and this is, I'm so long-winded making my points, but the key is, if you're in a debate with a conservative and you're marketing this data dividend, which is in effect a basic income, and they come at you and you're just going to send people, $500 or however much it is for doing nothing. Or, if they try to make that argument, you're just going to pay people to stay home, or you're going to pay people to do this. You flip the script on them and you say, I'm sorry, I don't think any Canadian has a problem with going after big tech who uses our personal information without compensating us, and blah, blah, blah. And then you instantly have everybody on your side. Whereas if it's marketed as a basic income... Make them support
big tech. Yeah.
Exactly. Whereas if it's marketed as just a plain old basic income, sometimes you run into the old classic welfare argument, well, those are just people staying at home and they're not working and they're this and they're that. With the data dividend frame, you avoid all of those attacks because you can just immediately pivot back to, well, doesn't somebody want to do something about big tech? Blah, 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 blah. And you'll have the public on your side. And I think that's what Justin Trudeau's team doesn't get as well. They have a lot of bold progressive ideas, but too often they've gone to implement them and they've gotten scared. And I don't know if that's because they realize that it's harder to govern than it is to campaign. I think that's part of it. And I think, you naturally run into hurdles. You're not able to do everything you want to do, for sure. But I think a large part of it is they're looking at those polls and they're looking at the demographics they need to win all the majority of seats in the GTA. And they're looking at the demographics they need to win a majority of seats in Quebec. And they know kind of the terms and the ideas that might scare these voters off, but they for whatever reason don't try to market around them. And I mean, you can't market around everything, but you sure as hell can market around a lot of stuff that we could easily do tomorrow. And I think the answer for progressives, particularly in the Liberal Party, who are questioning whether or not to stay in the party, is a leader that's brave enough to embrace progressive ideas that everybody supports across the spectrum and market it accordingly.
Well, just think in the U.S., conservatives and GOP and Fox News commentators will say how much they're afraid of critical race theory in the classroom, and critical race theory is so evil. But when you ask an ordinary conservative how to define critical race theory, can any of them actually give you a definition? No, and there's lots and lots of voters who are very similar, where they hear buzzwords and they're afraid of it, but they have no idea what it actually means. So when you're reading polling data that shows that people are afraid of socialism, who gives a shit? You can do
Socialism.
Exactly. You can do 90% socialism, but call it something totally different, and voters will like it. Or it's a classic example of like voters who say that they hate Obamacare, but they love the Affordable Care Act. Well, guess what? They're exactly the same thing, but they're marketed differently. Voters are not, and obviously I'm someone that likes to talk down to voters, but they're not as smart as everyone gives them credit for being, and I don't really blame them. You have lots of shit to do besides just being nerds like you and I, Liam. You can very easily shift pre-existing notions in the electorate by changing your marketing. And I think that's probably where a guy like Pierre Poilievre, who's bringing up like a lot of very far right ideas that we never would have accepted before, but marketing it as freedom, is doing so well. Like we have the perfect example on the right that we need to emulate on the left, I think. That's like we need that firebrand. And that's why I say like we need to get this level of interest in the liberal race to replace Justin Trudeau. And if you can't get that, if you can't get that charisma, if you can't get someone like Pierre Poilievre to fill up those stadiums, I think you're going to be in trouble. Because Trudeau could fill up those stadiums. I remember when Trudeau ran for the leadership in 2013, that was, I think, right before he was running. He was going out all across the country. And in my little community of Ponoka, Alberta, I think it's population like 7,000, in the middle of rural Alberta, where you think there's probably like 3 liberals who live there, he could fill a hall with hundreds of people who were interested in seeing him in the middle of rural Alberta, because he just had that magnetism about him. Like everyone wanted to see this guy, the son of the prime minister. It's going to be tough to find someone like it, but they can find it. Like, I mean, Pierre Poilievre is that guy. He came from absolutely nowhere to suddenly galvanize the movement. And I think Trudeau's hold on power and his personal magnetism is now really, really hurting the party's chance to replace him, because there's just no one in cabinet and there's no one in caucus who's been able to develop their own personal brand in the same way that Pierre Poilievre was given infinite latitude to do, even under Stephen Harper's famously tight leash.
Yeah. And I think it's a do or die moment for the Liberals, and do we trust the Trudeau team to make the right decision? I don't, but because I've gotten so cynical. But we'll see. I mean, we'll see how it plays out, and we'll see. I'm trying to be hopeful, and I hope that if he does step down, that we have some good progressive options that can tilt the party in a direction that we're embracing more of those ideas and not being as afraid of them. We're not just talking the talk, we're walking the walk. But speaking of, there's a lot of people in this country right now doing talking and walking, and some of the talking's out their butt, and some of the talking's out their mouth, and they're conservative leadership candidates, and they just finished. Selling
segue.
Memberships. What's that?
I love the segue.
Oh, good. Oh, I'm glad you liked that. Yeah, and they've just finished selling memberships. The deadline was June 3rd. And Patrick Brown announced he sold about 150,000 memberships. Pierre Poilievre's team sold over 300,000 memberships. The Charest team isn't releasing their numbers, but they're saying that they have enough to win for points, which, it sounds funny and it sounds pathetic, and they present it in a pathetic way. But again, I said earlier, Maxime Bernier, it was supposed to be his coronation in the 2017 leadership contest. It was supposed to be a cakewalk. A guy who sold 10,000 memberships, Andrew Scheer, won that race. So anything can happen, and membership sales do matter. But one thing to clear up is that when, let's say you go on, if you did what we did and you went on votescott.ca or whatever and you bought a membership, that doesn't mean that you're then committed to vote for Scott Aitchison. I mean, I do imagine that by and large, the bulk of the memberships each candidate sells is for them. but no voter in that leadership contest is like, just because you bought it from guy X or gal X doesn't mean you have to vote for them. And so I think we're going to see a lot of interesting moving and shaking over the summer. I mean, I do think Poilievre is still the favorite. I do still think that there's a possibility that if the more left-wing, or I don't even want to say left-wing, the more centrist factions in the Conservatives, if they can't get their shit together, it's quite possible Poilievre could win on a first or second ballot. But I don't think, I mean, there's signs popping up that it might not be that easy for him. I know a lot of Leslyn Lewis supporters are not wanting to vote for him because he's been forced, and this is quite wise actually by Charest, forcing him to say repeatedly that he's pro-choice, even though he is, makes him, it is quite smart, because now he's on the record like, yes, I'm pro-choice, and all the Leslyn Lewis supporters that maybe were thinking about ranking him second, I've heard via media sources that there is some doubt in the fact that a lot of Leslyn Lewis supporters will put him second.
He needs to win on the first ballot, basically, now. Yeah.
Yes, so pretty much he needs to win on the first ballot. And I think if he doesn't win on the first ballot, I think it's going to be challenging. I think his natural dance partner is going to be a guy like Roman Baber, who said that, I mean, he wouldn't really specify his views on abortion, number one, and he doesn't have to, because he's not getting that much support. But then, so he didn't really specify his views on that, and then he also said that he would leave conscious votes up to free votes, like the classic sort of conservative position. And so I think that's enough, probably, for some Lewis supporters to rank him second. But, you know, if Poilievre doesn't have enough dance partners, he could be in trouble, because I think everybody kind of knows that Brown and Charest are allies without explicitly saying so. And I think everybody kind of knows that Scott Aitchison, if forced to dance with Pierre Poilievre, who he repeatedly chided during the leadership debates, and a guy like Charest or Brown, I think the natural ally is somebody like Charest or Brown. So if Poilievre can't pull a dance partner in Leslyn Lewis, it's going to open up some significant challenges for him as the ballots go on. So basically, he needs enough of those 311,000 members of his that he sold, memberships. He needs enough of those people to vote for him on the first ballot so that it's a cakewalk. And there are points where each riding is weighted equally in the Conservative leadership contest. So it doesn't matter where your riding is located. It doesn't matter how rural your riding is. It doesn't matter how urban your riding is. Every riding is weighted equally. That's another factor. So how those votes distribute across those ridings and where those ridings are and how many memberships each candidate sold in which riding matters very much as well. And that's something that gets lost when you see all the headlines about, oh, X memberships are sold by this team. Like, it does matter, but it doesn't matter quite as much as you think.
Yeah, I'm wondering as well if Pierre Poilievre has something of a commitment problem in his members that he signed up. I mean, it's pretty rare for someone who bought a membership for you to vote for someone else, but it isn't uncommon for someone who buys a membership from a leadership candidate and then just chooses not to vote or forgets that they bought the membership and it doesn't send in their ballot. You need to keep those guys in your fold the entire time. So we have 90 days, basically, for Pierre Poilievre to lose his supporters or to lose his enthusiasm. And the type of voters that he has been entertaining, like he just put forward that private members bill to ban all vaccine mandates now and in the future. He's clearly going after, like, anti-vaxxers. He's clearly going after conspiracy theorists. He's clearly going after Freedom Convoy people. He's going after people who usually are not very politically involved. So I think that's a really open question as to whether or not they're going to continue to be politically involved. Maybe
I think a lot of them will. But will all of them, you know?
Yeah. Like, he could have done a genius move of politically activating him and creating a new class of voter we've never seen before, in which case, he's a genius. But if he is going after people who want to come to a rally, want to, camp in the street and, shit on the sidewalk for a few weeks, but then go home, those are not the basis of a successful political movement. So, maybe he got a bunch of people to sign up in his rallies, but is that the last time he's going to see them? Is he as organized as the Brown campaign or the Charest campaign, the pros who maybe they don't sell as many memberships, but they have really tight organizations, particularly with faith communities, with local town councils, with unions, that can actually push those guys out to the polls or push their members to send in their ballots by the mail. So I think that's a dynamic that isn't quite being covered here. It's not like an online vote, I don't think. You have to send in the mail, so there's a little more of an extra level of commitment that's required. And maybe Pierre Poilievre, his message doesn't really seem to me like it's one that attracts a particularly committed voter.
Yeah, I mean, I caution you when you say that. I mean, I think you're right in a lot of respects where, I think particularly with the rally situation, like I know he had to have his team doggedly chase after everybody to make sure that they bought a membership. And you're never going to get everybody. You're never going to get everybody that's in the room. They're going to walk away, or even if you get everybody, some of them are going to forget to vote. Like, you're absolutely right. But where I would caution you is with the Freedom Convoy Network. This is a group of people who are extremely motivated to vote for Pierre Poilievre. It started happening as soon as he started voicing his support. The protesters on the ground, blockaders I should say, on the ground, were saying, Pierre Poilievre is my guy. Like, he's looking after us. He's going to be PM. He's going to change things. He listens to us. And whether or not that's true, which it just patently is not true, he's not going to look after them. He's using them to coast to power. I do think they are incredibly motivated to vote for him. And I think, there's multiple reasons for that. I mean, one is, he's been, vehemently anti-institution. But not just that, he's been vehemently anti, what you would call anti-woke, like making it very clear he's against progressive values, and he's against what he calls cancel culture, and he's against, XYZ. That's nothing new, but it's the way in which he has made inroads to prove himself to be their guy, and that Max Bernier isn't their guy. Max Bernier did a sad speech at the convoy, and he'll get some votes. Like, he has a base, and some of those people will stick with him. But I think that Pierre Poilievre is, I hate to say it, quite wisely trying to pry off what the PPC has. So number one, it won't be as much of an issue in their election campaigns, but also because these are a group of people who, there's people in the convoy who don't even vote at all, let alone for the PPC. So he's trying to pull a very politically unmotivated group of people to vote for him, and they are fervently supporting him. So I think that's my only note of caution. Is I hope they all forget that they have a ballot, but odds are, if they're quite motivated, they will vote for him. And it'll be interesting to see if he can motivate enough people to carry himself through the first ballot, or if trouble starts to happen. I think if he can't get enough Lewis supporters on his side, that it will start to break down.
Well, so I guess that's what my question was: is he ideologically pure enough for these type of voters? Because his brand has suffered a lot, I think, in these debates of him being attacked by Leslyn Lewis for not being pro-convoy enough. And, of course, the Maxime Bernier is trying to do the same.
I supported the convoy. That's not true.
Yeah, and then that's
ridiculous.
He was forced.
Sorry.
It's a good impression. And it's just as ridiculous coming out of your mouth as it is coming out of his mouth. Like, I supported the terrorists more than you supported the terrorists. Like, come on, man.
It was so sad.
Holy hell, this is where we are in this country. But so he's being attacked for not supporting the convoy enough. As well, he's had to make very fervent condemnations of Pat King, who is a white supremacist and was one of the main leaders of the convoy. And, that's certainly wise to denounce a white supremacist, but when he's trying to court a white supremacist supporters,
yeah.
I think that's probably not going to end up being the ideal strategy for him. I think probably if I'm Pierre Poilievre, I would have wanted a scenario where people just forget about Pat King so that I don't have to say his name. I think the fact that he was forced basically by the Charest camp to condemn Pat King and condemn the more racist elements of the convoy, I'm going to guess that he isn't quite as perfect as the Freedom Convoy people might want. So yeah, I think he's saying mostly what they want, and if the Freedom Convoy people are going after political convenience, then yes, Pierre Poilievre is probably someone that's going to offer them 85% of what they want. But there's nothing about the Freedom Convoy movement that makes me think of them as being willing to compromise. So I think that if you see someone like Pierre Poilievre, who's not 100% in their camp, who's not willing to say absolutely everything that they want, it might spell some trouble, or it might be enough of a reason for a few of those guys to not send in their ballots. Particularly if you like, how are you gonna mail a ballot to your truck in the first place? Like, there's some just basic postal logistics questions that need to be resolved here.
Oh God. Well, I mean, lots of good points raised there, and I mean, I think it's the big question mark is going to be exactly what you said it is. Is he going to be able to turn these guys out or not? And I mean, I lean on the side of, I think he will be able to turn, at least 75% of them out, because some of those guys really like him. But the Charest and Brown campaigns have done a good job at making him look impure, and guys in that movement and gals in that movement like people who are ideologically pure, and Pierre Poilievre is now on record saying he's pro-choice. He's now on record saying he wouldn't touch supply management, which I guess is less of an issue for those people, but it starts to point out the inconsistencies in his views, and it slowly makes him look like the wolf in sheep's clothes that he is, and I think people will have a summer to reflect on that. And, I mean, past that point, the future is unwritten. We'll have to see. But I'm of the mind that it's going to be more interesting in September than we think it is. That's what I think, as of right now.
Yeah. So I think that the Brown-Charest path to victory, as you've basically described, relies on those two folding in together. It's Charest racking up the points in Quebec, racking up the points in Atlantic Canada. Even if he hasn't signed up a gross number of members, he has enough members in each of those ridings to max out the points. And then Brown, who's centered in Ontario, who's really good in Ontario, in the 905 and in places where the Conservatives aren't doing as well, has a huge turnout in Ontario, and those 2 points combine, and one of those two, either Brown or Charest, beats Pierre Poilievre. But the problem is that Brown has claimed that he has 150,000 members. Pierre Poilievre says that he has signed up more than 100,000 members in Ontario. So if they have roughly equal support in Ontario, the points necessary for Brown basically to add up to Charest and beat Pierre Poilievre might not be there. I've seen some commentators who are questioning the strategy of Pierre Poilievre, that they think that he's focusing his membership sales in places that he doesn't necessarily need to be focusing on, and that's sort of true. Like, he got a huge number of signups in Alberta where there isn't actually many points in Alberta. But he's so popular, he's basically gotten a huge level of support everywhere. So the question is simply, are Brown and Charest strong enough regionally that they can actually play the point game? And that's what remains to be seen. We have to see if Brown actually as good at organizing as he claims to be. He won one time in Ontario with that strategy. He can possibly do it again. Maybe will never be seen as a legitimate leader of the CPC if he wins that way. But definitely it's possible. Right now, though, the way that I'm seeing it, if everyone Pierre Poilievre has signed up comes out to vote for him, I don't think it's looking too good, even playing the points game. I think now Charest and Brown have got to find a way to depress PP's turnout if they're going to beat him.
I mean, it's been such a scorched earth campaign. Who's to say that after the count comes in and, let's say, Poilievre loses, who's to say that they're not going to litigate that? Like, I think This is going to be very ugly, to be honest. I mean, I think that, Charest or Brown could still prevail, but I think it is very much going to be an ugly fight. And, I mean, it depends where those 100, it depends on where the bulk of his 300-odd memberships are from. Because it's great to have 100,000 members in Ontario. Like, that's huge. But, like, if 100 of your 300,000 members are from Ontario, that lines up from a population perspective. But where are the other 200,000 coming from? Because if they're coming from provinces with less weight, then, it could spell trouble for him on subsequent ballots if it comes to that. So,
yeah. And he could have gotten like 20,000 members just in my riding of Red Deer Lacombe if he really wanted to. Like, there's definitely that many Conservatives there. Yeah. But they're still only worth 100 points in the one riding. Yeah. Yeah,
and that's the key. And I think with that, that's probably a good place to wrap up. I think we covered a lot of ground today. I hope you enjoyed listening as usual. And if you have anything to share with us, any thoughts, you can email them to speechfromthethrone@gmail.com. That's speechfromthethrone@gmail.com. Take good care of yourselves. Eat your vegetables. Try to get outside.
Your favorite vegetables.
Your favorite vegetables. And while you're at it, listen to Vegetables by the Beach Boys. And have a great
vegetable.
have a great week.
Bye.